It tracks 26 commitments across 5 key thematic areas: early years, education, housing and homelessness, safeguarding, welfare, and alternative care and mental health. While the team in the Alliance produced the report card, an independent panel of experts sets the grade in each of the sections. The report card is an important tool for us as advocates to take pause and analyse the commitments made to children and young people, and to put forward recommendations that children's rights are implemented across government. We have a fantastic lineup for you today for today's launch. We'll begin with an overview of the report from the Children's Rights Alliance, following which young people will take the lead with the youth panel, including representatives from the Alliance members, EPIC, the National Youth Council of Ireland, the Irish Second Level Students' Union, and spunout. Our youth panel will delve deeper into some of the promises made to children and young people and share their own experience of how these issues impact their and their peers' lives of day to day. Responding then, we will be joined by Kula Yasuma, Chair of the Young Ireland Advisory Council. There'll be plenty of time for questions throughout, and I'd encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box as we go through today's event. And also, if you could add who you want to address the question to. We'd also encourage you to engage in the conversation online using the hashtag ReportCard2026. So to begin with, I'm going to invite Dr. Naomi Feely, who's a Policy Director from the Children's Rights Alliance, to take us through the highs and lows of Report Card 2026. Over to you, Naomi.
Thanks, Colin. Just going to make sure everyone can see my PowerPoint there. So good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people online to join us here this morning for the launch of Report Card 2026. I'm going to take us through briefly the highs and lows of Report Card 2026. The report is currently available on our website, and you will see that it is quite a lengthy report. So I'm going to summarise some of the key issues that we've identified in our work over the last number of months. So Report Card 2026 is the first edition of this series of Report Card, which tracks commitments made by the government to children and young people in the latest Programme for Government. As you'll be aware, the Programme for Government was published in January 2025, and we saw a plethora of commitments made to children and young people. So not only those that we are tracking in Report Card, but a wide range of other issues. We've selected 5 key policy areas that we think could really transform the lived experience of children and young people right across Ireland. In these 5 key areas, we track 26 commitments, and we provide 25 grades to the government on how they progress in their first year of government. So the 5 key areas that we're looking at are early years, education, housing and homelessness, safeguarding welfare and alternative care, and mental health. If you look throughout Report Card, what you will see is that predominantly the government has received a number of C and D grades. The most frequent grade given to government was a C grade. We also see a number of D grades where we really feel the government is not taking sufficient steps in order to realise the ambitions they set out in the Programme for Government. In the area of early years in particular, we see 2 C grades. We've seen significant work throughout 2025 to continue progress in this area in order to tackle the issue of both affordability and invest further in capital funding for state-led services. In the area of education, we've tracked 3 commitments. We've given the government 2 Ds and 1 C+. In particular, we are specifically concerned about how the government is tackling issues such as exam stress, particularly caused by the end of secondary school exam leaving cert. So we've really focused in on senior cycle reform, and coupled with that, the commitment to really reform the CAO process. In the area of housing and homelessness, it'll be no surprise for anyone on the webinar this morning that the government received 3 D grades, 1 D+, and 2 Cs. We've really seen an entrenchment of the problem of child and family homelessness. And while we've seen really good ambitions by the government to significantly uprate the number of new social homes they are building, they are already failing to reach their own targets. In the area of safeguarding welfare and alternative care, we've been particularly concerned with a number of commitments the government has made to improve the systems available to support children, particularly children who are receiving services from Child Protection and Welfare Services, particularly TUSLA. We're also examining in this section commitments around online safety. We know the issues of online safety are of key concern to children and young people themselves and to their parents. It'll be no surprise that we see one C minus, two Cs, four C pluses, and one B minus grade. In the area of mental health, we see really good commitments in the programme for government that can really change children and young people's experience of accessing support through these services. However, the government has received two Ds, one C minus, and three C grades in this area. I suppose one of the things we want to really distill in my input this morning is to really tell you, well, what do these C and D grades mean? We all know from our time in school what C's and D's mean to us and how it maybe made us feel getting an A grade, getting a B grade, and how the government is perhaps feeling this morning receiving our report card. So in this report card, we have just one B grade, a B grade meaning good effort with a positive result for children. The C grade is the grade that the government has most frequently received in this report, indicating that it's a satisfactory attempt, but children are still left wanting. And we can really see that throughout the work that the government has undertaken in 2025, that they may have made a satisfactory attempt, but there really is much more to do. For the D grade, we awarded this grade to the government where we saw that they made barely an acceptable performance with little or no positive impact on children. And we've seen a significant number, I think it's about 8 D grades that the government has received. So there are areas that the government must undertake further action in the next 4 years. I'm going to take you briefly through some of the highlights of report cards. So these are the areas that the government received the highest grades. Firstly, in the area of safeguarding child protection and alternative care, we've awarded the government a B minus grade for really realising the belief that child protection is everybody's business. The government committed to ensure that an effective and mandatory cooperation would exist between state agencies by putting the interagency committee on a statutory footing. We've seen a very welcome development in 2025 with the inclusion in the Childcare Act, the revised Childcare Act that was brought before the Oireachtas last year. We've seen an inclusion of placing that committee on a statutory footing. We've also seen very positive progress in supporting and funding Coimisiún na Man in enforcing the online safety code. However, we would say that there is much more needed to be done, particularly in the area of introducing an independent complaints mechanism that can really ensure that children and young people's rights are upheld. In the area of legislating to regulate CAMs, many of you will be very familiar with the horrifying reports that we have heard from how CAMS is operating in certain areas of the country. We really recognise that the government is taking steps to ensure that there is regulation of CAMS right across the country. However, we really need to see a ramping up of this work this year, and it is only when these regulations are enshrined in legislation that we will really see the true impact. The government is making good progress in terms of developing standards for CAMS, and most importantly, they are including the voice and experience of children and young people in the development of these standards. And we would really commend them for that, but encourage them to continue to do so. Finally, in the area of early years, we have awarded a C grade for the government's commitment to invest in capital infrastructure and the development of state-led childcare facilities. The government has undertaken important work this year, particularly on being able to identify from an evidence point of view as to where the gaps are in childcare provision. We've seen a setting out of what a capital programme will look like in this area, and significant progress being made by the Minister for Children on this. In terms of the lows, I've picked out four key areas here where we really think there is still much more to be done. And in fact, the government is almost taking steps backwards. Firstly, in the area of building new social homes, the government very welcomely committed to build 12,000 new social homes each year. However, in their first year, they only built just over 9,000 new social homes, meaning they are already 3,000 homes behind target. While we've seen positive progress in the area of senior cycle reform, which we will continue to monitor throughout report card, we really need to see the government put further acceleration on the need to reform the CAO system. We know from children and young people that one of the key areas that impacts on them is the stress caused by exams. And these exams are feeding into a system whereby there's a strong focus on points and in order to progress to further education. International protection accommodation also receives a D grade this year. What we have seen over the last number of years is an increase in the number of children and young people and their family members living in an international protection accommodation, which is not subjected to standards. While there is a large group of children living in accommodation which is subjected to inspections by HIQA, the vast majority are living in accommodation that is not subjected to these inspections. We recently heard from our member Duras, who published a report into the lived experience of families in these accommodation centres. And what we can really see is a step backwards, almost returning to the early years of direct provision, where standards are incredibly low. So we really need to see the government step up action in this area and to move towards greater state provision of accommodation, as well as an introduction of standards and inspections in the accommodation, all accommodation that they are providing. Finally, in the area of mental health, we have no doubt are familiar with the number of children and young people on the waiting list for CAM services. However, what we have seen in the data when we reviewed the 4 report card, there's been a huge increase in the number of referrals to CAMs. What we would like to see is that the government really make good on its commitment to develop a new model of care for HSE primary care psychology. We think that this will be really critical in terms of the government moving forward to release some of the pressure on CAMs, but also to ensure that children and families can receive access to mental health care within their own local community at a lower threshold level. So we will be really investing in an earlier intervention of services here. For the next 2 slides, I just want to take you through some of the key statistics that help to inform and drive forward the areas of focus for Report Card 2026. What we can see from this slide is that while many children, and probably the vast majority of children in Ireland, do have a safe place to call home, where there is adequate standards and where they have a secure home that they're not at risk of losing, there are a number of children who are living in really precarious situations. We see that there are over 5,000 children living in emergency homeless accommodation, and this figure has increased substantially over the last 5 years. And throughout 2025, we have seen an increased number of children and young people living in emergency accommodation. We've seen some positive results of the youth homelessness strategy. However, despite a very positive supported housing for youth project being implemented under this strategy, only 15 young people were successful in securing a home through it. So we really need to see a ramping up of support, such as the supported housing for youth strategy, in order to tackle the precarity of accommodation that these children and young people are subjected to. As I mentioned earlier, just 75% of the target to build new social homes was achieved by the government last year, meaning they are already 3,000 homes behind. We really need to see this government keep good on its promise to build additional new social homes. In particular, we would like to see a real ramping up of local authority-led building. So not just a reliance on developers to provide turnkey homes. We think that that is really critical, and it could really turn the dial on the embedded housing crisis that we are now facing. Almost 10,000 children are living in emergency IPAS accommodation, and the vast majority of them are living in accommodation that is not subject to HIQA standards. We really need to see the government increase its focus in this area and invest in measures that will ensure that these children can access an adequate home. And finally, we know that there are a number of children living in special emergency care arrangements, and it's really critical that we invest in solutions in this area in order to ensure that they are kept safe and supported, as they're a particularly vulnerable cohort of our population. Finally, the last side I want to look at is looking at the welfare and well-being of children and young people. So we know from the areas that we've tracked that there are a number of ways in which children's well-being can be impacted. We know that 70% of students report experiencing high or very high exam-related stress. That exam-related stress is intrinsically linked to the CAO system, which we need to see reformed. The CEO system, as we're all aware, many of us on the call will have been through it, is the way in which to access further education. We've a very welcome commitment by the government to reform this system. However, we have not seen enough progress in this area in 2025. So we really think the government needs to quicken its pace on reforming the CAO, and alongside it, the work to redevelop a senior cycle. 1 in 8 children are a victim of image-based child sexual violence globally. We know that online safety is of critical concern to parents, children, and young people right across the country. It's really important that the government steps up its action in this area, that really holds the tech companies to account, and that they also bring in measures that ensures that children and young people can themselves hold these companies to account through an independent complaints mechanism. Finally, we see 4,500 children on the waiting list for CAMHS. We need to really ensure that supports are in place, that we reform the way in which CAMHS works, that we bring in those standards to ensure that all children can access high quality services, and also that we look at the system as a whole. How can we improve the mental health services for all children and young people in Ireland? Thank you so much for attending the report card launch today. Please, as Colin mentioned, you can put any questions in the Q&A box. You can also log on to our website today, where you'll find a copy of the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Just bear with me 1 second, sorry. Thank you, Naomi, for that really comprehensive overview of the highs and lows of this year's report card. It's great to see the progress is being made in the first year of the programme for government, and particularly in areas where where reform is well overdue, including in the senior cycle redevelopment and work to ensure cooperation between the state agencies in the child protection space. However, it is clear that the government has yet to hit the ground running when it comes to issues that have a major impact on the lives of children and young people, including accessing timely mental health care services or accessing safe and appropriate housing. To give us a better sense of how these issues impact children and young people's lives, we're delighted to be joined by youth representatives from the Alliance membership today, who'll give us a deep dive into these issues and discuss what is needed next. So we're delighted to be joined by Princess and Harrison. We're going to hear from them via video, and then we're joined on the panel here by Angelica and Jack. Princess is a member of EPIC's Youth Council. Harrison Rossiter Maguire is the Regional Liaison and Support Officer, and Louisa Tyrrell is the International Officer with the Irish Second Level Students' Union. Angelica is the National Action Plan member with Spunout, and Jack is a local champion with the National Youth Council of Ireland. So again, I encourage you all attending to raise any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get through as many of these as we can. You can also join the discussion online as we go along using the hashtag ReportCard2026. So another issue very much on top of the agenda for the Alliance over the coming years is the long-awaited reform of the CAO point system. And we're delighted to have input now from representatives of the Irish Second Level Students' Union that will look at this issue in more detail and give us all an insight into the impact the point system has on students.
Many young people sitting the Leaving Cert this year are faced with an inordinate amount of stress. Now this is coming from the academic side of, doing well in your exams, studying, preparing, and them wanting to do that well in their exams and the anxiety that's causing them. But then there's also the element of the admin side, registering with the CAO, registering to actually sit your exams, registering your subjects. Well, for junior cycle, that was all taken care of by the school. When it comes to the Leaving Certificate, you have to do that yourself. And while some people, that's grand, there's a lot of people who wouldn't have experience doing stuff like this. And so they are struggling and they are worried, have I put down the right subjects? Have I put down the right levels? Have I put down the right college courses? And not even just on the college courses, it's not just have I put down the ones I want, but are the ones I put down, is that what I actually want to do with my future? Or am I putting it down because a friend of mine said he was doing it and I thought it was cool? And so there's these constant worries kind of flowing around. But then on the other side of it, you also have people who are who are completely apathetic because they have become so worn out and burnt out by their schooling, by their education, that they just want to sit the exams, leave school, and never look back. And I feel like that's not healthy either. You need people, you don't want people to be stressed, but you want them to want to do well. And you don't want people who couldn't care less and just want to leave. You need you need to create a space where people are happy and comfortable to be on that day-to-day basis and aren't just wishing it all away, wanting the end to come.
Hi chuirde, is mi se Louisa Tír agus tám an ifigach idirnáisiúnta san Aontas Daltaí ar bhain scoil na hÉireann. Hi, my name is Louisa and I'm the ifigach idirnáisiúnta or International Officer of the ISSU. In relation to the first question that was asked, what are there aspects of the system that work? Yes, of course, there are aspects of the system that work for some students. For students who enjoy learning facts and figures and are able to do rote memorization as well as replicate that in an exam and timed context, yes, the system can work for them. However, overall, the system is not accessible and does not work for the vast variety of learning types that do exist. In addition to this, there are some developments that have been made in recent years that are very positive, such as the introduction of more continuous assessment, the orals that exist in senior cycle languages. These are all ways in which students can be catered to who may learn differently than just memorization. So though we have seen positive developments, overall, unfortunately, the system widely does not work other than for a very specific type of person. In relation to the second question of what aspects need to change, of course, there are a vast number of answers to this and I won't be able to touch on them all. I'll try and give a brief overview of a few of them, especially the ones that we are campaigning about with the ISSU. First and foremost is the timing of orals. At the minute, the Leaving Cert orals are in Easter, and this really needs to change, as the fact that they are placed in what should be a school break prevents students from taking much needed rest and adds additional stress. Another systemic issue is funding for Gael schools, Gael Colosdi, and the lack of Irish medium textbooks and resources that are available. Students who undertake their education through Irish should not be put at a disadvantage. Recent questions around whether projects should be given the extra percentage of marks awarded for taking your education through Irish really show where we're at with Irish medium education, and this really should not be happening. Subject options both for Gael schools and Gael Colosdi, but also for Desh schools and for schools that are single gender, is also a big problem. Students should not be put at a disadvantage for what subjects they can and can't choose based on what school they go to. Again, in terms of facilities, the presence of continuous assessment is brilliant, but once again, facilities in different schools can impact the quality of students' work, and this needs to be assessed to ensure that all students have equal access to resources. In terms of equal access to resources and whether the system is a meritocracy, is the grind system. The fact that some students can access grinds due to their social and financial capital while other students can't, which is enabling some students to succeed more than others, which has been shown, shows that that is a failure of our system and that students should be given a level playing field no matter what background they're coming from. Finally, in terms of accessibility, supports for students with disabilities and neurodivergencies need to be improved across the board to ensure that there is an adequate standard of education available to all students.
If I was Minister for Education, I think the first change I would implement is to move the oral examinations back out of the Easter holidays. At the moment, students across the country are preparing to sit their oral examinations beginning this Saturday. I believe that the oral examinations should be moved out of the Easter holidays. The Easter holidays are the last substantial break students get from school before the Leaving Certificate. I believe they should have the chance to completely turn off from school and not worry about it at all, to relax and mentally prepare themselves for the upcoming examinations that will be taking place in June.
Thank you so much to the Irish Second Level Students' Union for their contribution today and their own work raising their concern about the stress students are being put under by the current system. You'll have noted that we asked what would they change if they were the minister, and this is something we'll be revisiting in the discussion. And we may hear more about young people's educational experiences now in our live discussion. And with that, let me welcome our panelists joining us live today. We have Angelica, as I said, who's a member of spunout's National Action Panel, and Jack, who's a local champion with the National Youth Council of Ireland. Angelica, I might start with you, and then maybe Jack, you might answer the same question. So you've both read the report. Are there high grades or low grades that jump out to you in the report?
Jack, would you like to go first, or?
Yeah, that's no problem. So personally for me, I think the high grades was the progress for the reform of the senior cycle. I think the introduction of new subjects and projects across several subjects is really positive because it gives students who maybe struggle with the exam a bit more of a chance, because 40% for some of the projects is a huge percentage and it kind of levels the playing field. But I think the low grades was the mental health. I mean, 2Ds, 1C, 1C minus, and 3Cs were really low. And I think it just shows the lack of progress that the government is making in terms of youth mental health. The mental health budget is quite big, but the proportion given to youth mental health is so small. And the CAMS waiting list is over 4,000 children, which is a crazy number of young people to be waiting to get support. And then also, I think the lack of new social houses. So the promise is 12,000 per annum, and it's 9,000, which again is just contributing to the homeless crisis. Angelica, if you want to join in.
Yeah, I'd really just like to echo what you're saying. I mean, even if we're looking at the high grades, the government aren't getting any A pluses, guys. You know, even their high grades have a lot of progress that they need to make. But obviously, what is screaming at me in all caps really is the lack of progress that is being made on the lower end. You know, we're seeing that the government has committed itself to build 12,000 social houses per annum, and at the minute it's just above about 9,000. Like, that's really not good enough. We do need to see progress on this. And as well, one of the things as a young person who's gone through the process myself that really is so important is that reform of the CAO system. We need to see concrete development on this. It can't just be internal discussions. It's something that's been in place for decades, long before I was born, and it's something that needs change. And honestly, it needed change years ago. So we need to get that ball moving straight away.
Great, thanks, Angelica. Just on education then, and you've mentioned there the CAO system and the senior cycle reform. What insights can you both share from young people who are currently preparing for this year's Leaving Cert? And are there particular aspects of the current system that work well for young people, and what needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, I sat my Leaving Cert before, so I have a bit of a different perspective. But what I can tell you is for young people, when it comes to the leaving cert, it's really, really difficult space because it's not just an exam, it occupies this sort of cultural space in Ireland. You will see it and you will hear it. If you're at home, your parents have the radio on, there's going to be discussion about the leaving cert. If you're taking a break from your studies and you're on social media, there is going to be a targeted ad from a grinds company trying to sell you things that if you're a student from a lower socioeconomic background, you probably can't afford. The leaving cert puts so much pressure on young people. It's not just in education, it's really in every facet of your lives. It's incredibly stressful because of the stakes that it has for you. And not just the stakes that you put on it yourself, it's really what we as a society view it as. The one thing I used to think of when I would think of the leaving cert is every year, um, you'll see a report published in the news about the school feeder tables. And what that is it's measuring success essentially on how many students have gone on through the CAO to education. And it's ranking schools based on that. But that is giving no weight to students who might have taken a year out, students who have done an apprenticeship, or students who are going on to further education and training. And I think that's one of the big bugbears I have is as a society, we put too much emphasis on this one thing, and it's something that we need to change.
Great, thanks. And Jack?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm similar in your situation that I have sat my leaving cert. I sat it in 2024. And I think there are positives, such as I think the access program is very good for Dare and Here students, but I don't think it is enough. I mean, I think it does give a little bit more level to students who are at disadvantage. I've come through the Dare system and it did help in terms of getting to college, but there's not enough support. And I think accessing the supports in school for exam supports is a lot easier in college, I found. So when you go through that access program there, it's, you know, straight away there's you don't need evidence, you don't need, once you're in, you're in. But with school, I found it really difficult to get exam accommodations. I didn't get any. Um and I think that there should be more support for students who have lost a close family member during the leaving cert. So at the moment, there's no supports. And I think if the government could bring in an exemption or a scheme similar to DARE to help support those students. And again, I think it was highlighted in the report and from the ISSU, the stress and pressure under young people. So like as Angelica said, it's kind of when you're in the leaving cert, it's your whole life. It's the be all and end all. And I just think the like report that 70% of students have high levels of stress is crazy. Like that's, you know what I mean? It's 2 years long and you're just in this bubble for 2 years and it's really stressful. And I think we need more options and we need more supports to kind of allow us, you know, to know that this isn't everything. Like there's life beyond the leaving cert. And I don't think that's, you don't feel that until you've actually gone through the leaving cert. So I think we need more, you know, support during the leaving cert and the reform of the CAO to give us more options.
Great, thanks. And so if you were the Minister for Education, what's the one action you would take to improve students' education experience?
Jack, do you want to start off?
Sure. So I think if I was Minister of Education, the one thing I would do is would give more alternatives to the CAO system. I understand that there's plans, you know, for this to change, but I think with a lot of things, it's always in the works or there's plans for it. And I don't think, you know, I'm sure when they started the conversations, those students are well past graduating college. You know, I think it's taken very long for the reform of the CAO to happen, but I think there needs to be more options, more apprenticeships, and more pathways for young people because ultimately the leaving cert isn't suited for every student, and I think so many students are losing out on, you know, career prospects that they could be really good at because it's all based on one final exam. So I think the whole reform of the CAO system would improve so many young people's lives.
Right.
Angelica.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I think while I agree, I'll touch on something slightly different. And I think that as Louisa had touched on previously, is when it comes to the new leaving certificate subjects that are being introduced, it's fantastic because I think a lot of students need to have different options. But the issue is having more subjects doesn't necessarily mean every student has access to them. Typically, if you are in an all girls school, a single or an all boys school, you will have a different range of subjects that you would not have access to if you were in a mixed educational school. And also, if you were in a private school, you'll have better options to more subjects and better facilities. So, what I really do think needs to happen is when we're talking about reforms, when we're talking about changes, we're making sure that what we already have is available to a lot of students. Because if I wanted to do home economics and I was in an all boys school in my hometown, that is not an option and that is not okay. I think we need to really tackle that as well, because with education, I think we need to make sure that every student has access to the same opportunities as the other. It's not good enough. And as we've seen with the CEO, I mean, it's not necessarily equitable. It might be the same for everyone, but that's not equitable because we don't all have the same home life. We don't all have the same background. And currently with the CEO, we're all treated the same, but that is not the reality for every student in Ireland.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Just moving on to the area of mental health and CAMS and primary health supports. And what barriers do young people face in accessing timely and appropriate care and support from mental health services? Maybe Angelica, we'll start with you this time and then go to Jack, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, from the report, and as Jack has previously mentioned, if you're looking at the waiting lists, it's simply not good enough. There is more than 4,000 people on a waiting list for CAMS. If there was 4,000 young people on a waiting list to get medical treatment because they all had a broken arm, we would be hearing it in the news every single day until that was solved. We are not seeing the same urgency with this mental health crisis because that is what it is. It is a mental health crisis. If we are not giving young people access to these services, things will get worse and it will have a huge detrimental effect on their lives. As we've just heard already, over 70% of young people are already highly stressed by the leaving certificate. If those students are also having mental health issues and they can't access support, then I think that says a lot about the situation that we're currently in. It's not just one thing, it's everything. Everything is so linked.
And Jack? Yeah.
I completely agree. I think waiting lists is the biggest barrier. I also think while a young person has, reached out for help, they're put on a waiting list, and CAMS waiting lists can be up to 4 years. And I think there needs to be support for young people in the meantime when they're on the list, because by the time a young person reaches out, they could be at a critical point. And if they're being told they have to wait a couple of months, imagine how like disheartening and frustrating that must feel, because they've plucked up the courage to speak up and say that they need help, and now they're on a list for a couple of months. And I think in terms of that, I think again it kind of shows the gap in socioeconomic groups, because if your family and yourself, you can afford private therapy, it can be upwards of €90. And then again, you're growing the gap between, what I mean, people who are at a disadvantage, they can't afford, help to speak to someone. I think it's a really big barrier. And then unfortunately, I think there still is the stigma around reaching out, I think more in rural communities. And it's harder for some people to admit that they need help. And I think we need to reduce the stigma and kind of grow more understanding around mental health.
Okay, great, thanks. And so on the same team, then, if you were the Minister for Health, what's the one action you would take that would improve young people's experience of or engagement with the mental health services or the mental health system? And I don't mind who wants to be the first minister, so it's Jack.
I'll just go with this one then. So if I was Minister for Health, I would increase the funding for the mental health sector. I think the minister should meet with more young people, hold more consultations, because to get the most honest feedback is you need to speak to young people who've been through the system. You need to ask for honest opinions and engage with them about their experiences. I think more funding would allow for shorter waiting lists, more staff to be trained, and more support for young people. I'd also ensure that there's support for people on the waiting list. And I think also like the transition from CAMS to AMS that was highlighted in the report as well. If they could increase the age of CAMS to 25, because once you're 18, you're kicked out of CAMS, and there can be young people waiting and they're kind of stuck in the gap between there being a place available for them in the adult mental health services. So I think more funding towards youth mental health would provide so much more support.
Yeah, I would really echo what Jack is saying there in terms of the transition from child and adolescent mental health services to adult services. As we all know, that period between childhood and adolescence, it's not the easiest time for everybody, and adulthood and maturity, it doesn't start at age 18. So I think I'd like to see a more joined up approach there. And also I think the big thing here is we need more funding, we need more staffing, and we really need to cut those waiting lists down. No child should be on a waiting list for the length that some of them are.
Right. All right. Thanks about that. Just moving on then, the area of housing. And what type of housing and accommodation supports do young people need?
I think young people need more affordable housing. I think at the moment for young people, even at college, the rents on campus are like extortionate, and to most people, they're not affordable. So you're looking at commutes for up to 3 hours for some students a day each way. And then I think kind of back to the education, then that continues to exclude certain demographics from attending college due to the cost. I think young people are going to be stuck at home for the foreseeable, and very few young people can afford to move out at the moment. I think there needs to be more schemes for young people to help move out of their homes. Um, I mean, unfortunately, not all young people are in a position to stay at home as well. So then you're leaving young people at risk of homelessness. So I think there needs to be more schemes specifically for young people who can't live at home. The waiting lists for social housing is years. It's recommended to get on it as soon as you can, but you could be 30 by the time you get a place. And then if you look at HAP, it's so difficult to find rental that will accept HAP. So I think more support for the young people who are at risk of homelessness. I mean, over 5,000 children being homeless is disgraceful for a country like Ireland.
Thanks, Jack. Angelica?
Yeah, definitely what Jack said. When it comes to housing, I think there's so many really important issues highlighted in that report. And it is so important, specifically for young people, when we're talking about the CEO and we're talking about that move to university, that students have the option to live somewhere. If you are living in a rural village in County Kerry and you want to go to college in Dublin, you might not be able to afford that, not because of the cost of university or the cost of living, but because you have nowhere to live. And that is just point blank unacceptable. We're seeing a lot of student accommodations being built, but their prices are so high that the only people who can afford them are international students. I think we need to see more initiatives like cooperative models that you can see in Scotland. But also when it comes to the wider housing crisis in Ireland, when you're a young person and you're looking at the news and you're trying to build a future, because we are so often told that we are the future, a lot of young people are thinking, well, actually, maybe my future is in Australia, because it's so hard to find somewhere to live in Ireland that's not your parents' box room. And that's even if you're in a position that you can live in your parents. If you are a young person and you come out as gay and your parents are not tolerant, you cannot be expected to have to stay in your parents' house. But unfortunately, for some people, that is what they have to do because it's unaffordable to be a young person in Ireland, to be completely honest.
Great. Okay. So if the Minister of Housing is listening in this morning, what's the one thing you'd like him to understand about young people's experiences?
I think that they need to understand that us young people, we're doing the best we can. I think too many people are putting the onus and the burden onto us to tell us that we're not doing enough or we're not saving enough and that our lifestyles are too expensive. I mean, I think, the typical thing is like, young people are buying avocados and avocados are expensive. And it's like, the reality is it's not on us, it's on the government. We shouldn't be, you know, we're on minimum wage. Most of us are on minimum wage, whether we're in college, apprenticeships, we're on a quite like low rate. We're, struggling to make ends meet as is. And the blame shouldn't be on us. It should be on the government. The lack of support that we're given, the lack of houses being built, and the cost of living. Yeah, I think too much or too often that the blame is on us, and it shouldn't be. they need to support young people, put in support, give us more money, and allow us to be able to move out of our homes.
Right. Okay.
Jack put that really, really well. And I will just also touch on something that was mentioned a lot in the report. I don't have personal experience of homelessness, but I understand the seriousness of it. And judging by the response from the department and where we're at in terms of building more houses and with emergency accommodation, I think we really need to focus on the human cost because no child should have to grow up in a hotel. The effects of long-term homelessness and living, and not knowing where you're living, not having a roof over your head is so detrimental to a child's development. When we're talking about issues like education, we're talking about issues like mental health. A lot of that relies on having a safe place to call home. So if you don't have that, you are at such a disadvantage, and that is completely unacceptable in this day and age.
Great, thank you. I can just see from the reactions coming through, there's a huge amount of support for what you're both saying there. So thanks a million for that. I'm just going to just check in and see if there's any questions in terms of the specifically for you guys. Senior cycle reform and changes to the CAO system are welcome, but how can the government or policymakers address the more fundamental issue of retention when only 25% of travellers and 58% of Roma students sit the Leaving Cert? Does this point to a need for much broader reform and urgently targeted supports beyond assessment and entry pathways? So I'm not sure if either of you have a view on that.
If I may, there was a really good report that came out about last week, and I know I believe you're from Pavy Point.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great work done there, and I think what really highlights is how students from the traveling community are so discriminated in Irish schools. It was the Roots to Racism report. And in Ireland, I think, if we want to improve retention, it's not just about entry and how we view school. It's also about how we welcome people from minorities in schools in Ireland because there's really not enough being done there. And I think there needs to be a lot more done there because we can't expect people to thrive if they're not being treated well in school, if they're suffering racial discrimination in school, because that is happening. And I think that's something that our education system point blank does not do enough to do. And I think that's a huge key element there. But also, I think that needs to be something that is specifically targeted because that's something that we all need to do better in. Because every child, no matter what your background is, you should be able to go to school, you should be able to thrive.
Right. Thanks. Okay. As I said, it's just been a brilliant contribution today from the discussion from you both, and thank you very much. It's fantastic to see young people ready and willing and able to engage on the issues that impact on their lives the most. There is, however, huge responsibility on government and wider stakeholders to ensure that we're making every effort to deliver the changes so eloquently expressed by our panel today. And to discuss this and more, let me introduce our next speaker, Kula Yasuma. Kula is chair of the Young Ireland Advisory Council, a key part of the governance of Young Ireland, the National Framework Policy for Children and Young People. She's also chair of the Board of Management of the Oberstown Children's Detention Campus. She's an established leader in the area of children's rights and youth justice. She served as the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People from 2015 to 2023, working to safeguard the rights and best interests of children. And Kula is also a former director of Include Youth, a rights-based organisation working with young people involved in the criminal justice and care system in Northern Ireland. So thank you, Kula. So I might start by asking you for your responses to the issues and ideas for change that our youth panelists have raised. And again, as we hear from you, I want to remind attendees to please use the Q&A box to raise any questions you might have.
Thank you, Colm, and yes, and thank you so much to Angelica, to Jack, to Princess, and to young people from the Students' Union who have provided the reality of some of the things that the CRA have been talking about in this report card. Just by way of introduction, I have a long relationship with the report card. In 2017, when the Child's Rights Alliance published it, I had a look at it. I was then Commissioner for Children here in Northern Ireland, and they published it, and I were running around the office going, I want one of these for Northern Ireland. I wound my neck in after a while, but what we did do and inspired by the report card was we produced and subsequently produced two more in 2018, a statement on children's rights. We didn't use the grading thing, but we did use your methodology. So just to let you all know that you've been inspiring me and my work for many years, and I thank you for that. So just the issues that have been talked about are really important. What I do want to do, and you've mentioned my foray into the south of Ireland and the two roles I have, and here visual aids are always good. I haven't got a video, but I've got two visual aids. So Young Ireland, and then my heart. My heart is youth justice and how we implement rights in youth justice and my involvement with Oberstown. And towards the end of the conversation with Jack and Angelica, you were talking about homelessness and the impact it has on young people. And I just want to give a little bit of response from some of the young people in Oberstown on this very issue. They did a response to the recent consultation on the homelessness, child and youth homelessness action plan, and reflecting on some of the things that Angelica and Jack said, the issues that they raised, and Grania Smith from Oberstown is on this seminar and may share their response more widely. But they were a group of 8 young people in Oberstown wanted the government to know these things, and they wanted the government to know. A lot of them had experienced homelessness and housing insecurity, and had also or knew people who had. They wanted to say that being homeless or having being affected by housing insecurity affects every aspect of a young person's life. Education, mental health, feeling safe, family life, everything. And that but having a secure house, as we know under the UNCRC, living in safety and stability is actually one of their rights. They also talk about emergency accommodation not feeling safe, sometimes having stigma attached to it, so they feel othered. They don't feel they can bring their friends home. They don't feel that you can have a family life in accommodation. And I do recall a young person who was in the North equivalent of IPAS accommodation saying, it took us 2 years to get to Ireland. We've been in this accommodation, temporary accommodation, for a year. I just want to taste a home cooked meal. I just want to sit around the table with my family and eat as a family. My mum's a great cook, and I've not tasted her cooking for years. And that everyday thing that we expect of my own children had growing up. How is that not something that's experienced by all children across this island? So that, like I said, they talk about the isolation. They talk about the fact that when they go to school, the fact that schools don't always know that they're in those difficulties, that they're in emergency accommodation or have housing, temporary accommodation. Schools aren't trained, schools aren't aware, so when they go to school tired, when they go to school hungry, when they go to school maybe a little bit smelly because they haven't got proper bathing facilities, they felt the stigma of that, and that resulted with them disengaging with school. I'm not going to go on because I know, Colin, we've got lots of questions, but I know we're ahead of time. That's why I'm asking you to indulge me. So the other thing they talk about, and this speaks to what Angelica said about leaving care. So if a young person in Oberstown is in care, then they will obviously be subject to care to aftercare and when they leave. But some young people are not formally in care, although probably are known, and that has an impact on them. And often they leave very close to their 18th birthday, and they do sometimes talk about the cliff edge of accommodation and not having proper accommodation when they leave, and how that affects their ability to engage in rehabilitative services. Homelessness, they say, affects more than where we sleep. It affects our ability to enjoy our rights equally with other children. We feel that this strategy, the action plan, is an opportunity for the Irish government to address homelessness as a child's right and welfare issue and put emergency supports in place that are easy to access and act fast in light of a pending crisis. So just quickly having a quick scroll to think. They also just finally talk about homelessness as a direct result of another person's behaviour, bearing in mind their children living in a family setting. And you can take of that what you will. I don't want to put words in their mouth. And that some of our families' housing has been put at risk because of something we or others have done. And again, they've asked the removal of eviction for families and also removal of eviction for children, particularly if they've been in care of the state. So I just wanted, sorry, Colin, thank you for indulging me. I just wanted to add that perspective from young people who so this would have been at the beginning in January, who were in Overstown. Many are, some of whom are still there. But moving on, and just to reflect more on what I've heard today before we move in to some of the programme for government, and please ask any questions that you may have. But I also want to say, a lot of the issues have resonated over the last 30 years, and I too am baffled as to why it takes so long to get movements on some things. The criteria on leaving care that Angelica was talking about, it's really, really important that we begin to look at that. We talked about housing and homelessness, mental health and well-being. I'm disappointed to see what I've seen here, because there's been a lot of profile and investment. I can talk about Young Ireland later on, Colin, if you have questions on that.
Yeah.
And the 4,000 on the waiting list speaks to, for me, whether something could have been done to prevent them ever getting to the waiting list. Where are the early, are we? I know there's lots of plans, and I'm hoping that the plans as they roll out, that we see the waiting lists decrease as early intervention and prevention services come in and get into place. There's been obviously a lot of talk about the leaving certificate and the CAO, a system that I'm still grappling with because it's very different to the one we have in the north. But as Angelica and Jack were talking, it did make me think about what is the purpose of education, and it is referenced in the report card. But the UNCRC is very clear about the purpose of education. It's about more holistic. It's about the whole child. It's about talents and abilities, and it's about building a confident, resilient young person for the here and now and going into the future. And if what you're hearing from your older children in the education system is that it's not inclusive, that it's focused entirely on exams, then is that an education system fit for purpose? When what we need our education system to take into account for. So these are just questions I have coming out of what Jack and Angelica have said, and what Naomi talked about in the report card. So Colin, what was your question that you asked me?
Well, I think it was an open question. I suppose a few questions for you, Kula, and we've obviously been fortunate to hear from Jack and Angelica and Princess and the ISSU. But I suppose, and your own experiences there with Oberstown, but how do we ensure that children and young people's views, their voices and their experiences are shaping policy and legislative developments over the lifetime of this government?
Thanks for that question. And that's really important, because we know that whenever we're looking at assessing the rights of children in any situation, one of the things we have to include is how they and their families experience those rights. So, the saying "nothing about us without us" is so very, very true. So an obvious way for me, and for most children's rights advocates, activists, is the legal incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic legislation, which would then give Articles 12 and 13, which is the ones concentrating on rights and to express views and take them into account, which would then give them a legal backing, which would make it law. and there's no excuse. And particularly coming off the back of the constitutional change back in 2015, 2016, I think. Apologies, I'm not as up to scratch as I should be. But as we wait for that to happen, there's other ways to fulfil that commitment. So the Irish government are lauded. I've recently been doing some work internationally, and I can't tell you how much are lauded around the world with regards to its participation materials, how it's adopted a whole framework around the London model. Hub No is second to none. It's exceptional. But there is a lot of work to be done in realizing the rights, in taking that all the way. The groundwork is there. So firstly, I think state agencies, including my own in Oberstown, we have an oversight agreement. The government department keeps an eye on us and makes sure that we're doing everything we're supposed to do, which is primarily keeping children and our staff safe. But in every state agency that has any involvement or agreement with children, I think it should be in their mandatory statutory oversight agreement that the voice of the child is included in all decisions that affect the child. So do they have the right mechanisms, and including how they feedback and implement? I'm very, very, very proud of Oberstown, and I'm happy to take the credit, but Grania and the team in Oberstown are phenomenal but we still have a way to go. So I think every state agency should be held to account formally by the government department. And similarly, the government itself should be held to account. And the relationship between the National Council for Children, Children's Parliament, and how it relates to government is really, really importantly. Secondly, the child rights and youth impact assessment templates have been developed by the Department for Children, and that's a measure that should be implemented by every government body when it's considering what it does in relation to children, whether you're building a new road, whether definitely with environmental concerns, as well as within schools, within TISLA, within those more obvious agencies. And in that way, within that, there's a section that said, have you listened to the voice of children, young people? And so it's so important that the people who mark this, how government is doing around children's rights, which is great to see so many young people today, is children, young people themselves. And we need to know where they believe that they have had the space and the voice to amplify their voices and the audience, so that they can influence the decision making concerning their lives. I hope you all saw what I did there with that line. I was determined to do that line. So it's really important that children, young people mark government or feedback to government and every aspect of government, all the way from the Oireachtas all the way to local government, around where they've had space, voice, influence and audience. So that's quite a lot there, Colin, but I hope that's an answer.
I think that it's great and very comprehensive. I think it's very important what all the messages you're saying. So maybe then, just in your role as chair of Young Ireland's Advisory Council, can you give us an overview of the priorities in the national strategy and the policy framework it outlines for children and young people in Ireland?
So yeah, very, very happy to. And this is the health woman. I don't speak for Young Ireland. I chair a group of civic society organisations, and we advise Young Ireland. That Young Ireland is a government strategy, and the minister and the department obviously speak for it. But I'm very proud to be involved with it, and to outline the process. So as most of you know, Young Ireland is the successor framework. I've got my notes here, so I'm splitting between two screens. Is the successor framework for better outcomes and brighter futures. And it aims, and this is what Young Ireland says, it aims to achieve an Ireland which respects and realises the rights of children and young people. And taking into account what some of the young people have talked about around transitions being really difficult, and that maturity is not an age thing, it's dependent on so many things. Young Ireland goes all the way so it goes from birth all the way to 24 to make sure that transition services and young people are supported through transitions into adulthood. The framework has 67 strategic action across covering every aspect of a child's life, and under those 67, there's many sub actions, and I can never remember how many sub actions there are. So we'll stick with the 67, shall we? And those
just don't make any 6-7 references there, Kula, if you
oh,
want to say,
crikey. Yeah, exactly. Well done, Colin, for picking that up. You're more down with the kids, or what was last year's down with the kids than me. Well done, you. So most of the strategic actions are against 5 outcomes. I've got a bag here that has them, and another tool, but I'll not do that. So the 5 outcomes in order to improve children's lives are being active and healthy, achieving in learning and development, being safe and protected from harm, having economic security and opportunity, and connected and being connected and respected, and contributing to the world. But for any process, you need enabling actions. So there are 18 enabling actions, which are which more or less reference what the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about in their general comment number 5, which is around how do you implement children's rights in the UNCRC. And in addition, and this has really helped, this event here has really helped hone my thinking on there's 3 spotlight areas where when the strategy was being developed were the 3 major, what bubbled up as 3 of the most pressing issues in the state: child poverty, mental health and well-being, and disability. And again, a lot of that has been reflected in the report. So the Young Ireland is a tangible and stated measure of implementation of children's rights. It acts as the implementation document framework for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and therefore is the programme for government for children, which is where it comes, it interfaces with Securing Ireland's Future, the programme for government. So at the moment, it's in mid-review, and we may talk about that in a minute as well. And like I said, I chair a group of rowdy, vociferous, stroppy civil society organisations who have taught me so much in the 9 months I've been with them. And I'm looking forward to working with them as we advise and try to shape Young Ireland going forward.
Yeah, so you mentioned there, Kula, that it's coming up to the midterm review of the strategy. So what's the capacity of Young Ireland to support implementation of the programme for government and to address the critical issues that are there for children and young people?
So, I mean, any programme for government is by its very nature high level because it's a whole population programme. So it relies on what called sub strategies. So and any government strategy from the minute the programme for government was published should have in my view, these are all my personal views, just to say, if they grate with anyone, keep an eye on my LinkedIn profile, because suddenly if open for work appears, then I've said something today I shouldn't have said. But every strategy, in my view, coming out from government, once the programme for government has been published, should directly reference the programme for government and how it's implementing the programme for government. Now, obviously, Young Ireland predates the current programme for government, but there are definite complementarities. There's definite and as the review is more of a light touch review. It's not a root and branch review. It's a light touch review. So as we go into the review, ensuring that coherence continues is really, really important, because there's things in the programme for government. No, there's things in Young Ireland that are not in the programme for government, and a little bit vice versa, not that much. Most are contained in some shape or form in Young Ireland. Just to say to everybody, Young Ireland is, like Colin said, having a midterm review, and on the website there's a questionnaire, and it's one questionnaire for everyone, and I hope young people find it accessible. So Angelica and Jack, please fill it in. It's really accessible. The team in DCD really want to hear, and the minister particularly really wants to hear what people think about Young Ireland, what can be tweaked maybe, what spotlights might be important, although I'm not sure, we're not done with the spotlights. The issues are not resolved, but spotlights are about, do things need momentum? we so I think Young Ireland has to be, like I said, coherence between Young Ireland and the programme for government, in my view. And I see no reason why that is not the case, as I read them both.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks a million, Kula, for that. That's really interesting to hear and to get your perspective on it. So I suppose we're coming towards the end. We are, as we said, we're ahead of time, and we do have a few questions in the Q&A, and encourage people to put some more in there if you have them. And again, to remind you, if you could, if you want to direct a question to a specific person, please just call that out in the question. It just makes it easier for me as chair to kind of direct the questions to the right people. So just a couple of things in the Q&A box. The first is just I think it's more of a comment, but maybe I might push back to you, Naomi. So April 3rd, there'll be a detrimental change to regulation of platforms' rights to search for child sexual exploitation. Pressure needs to be put on our MEPs to address this on Thursday. So I don't know, Naomi, if you have any viewpoint you want to expand on with that.
This is a really important point that's been raised by Anya in the questions. I was just as we finished the content for report card, my wonderful colleagues from our online safety team, Nolene Blackwell and Alex Murphy, informed me that it was actually already out of date, and this was because of a significant issue that emerged at the EU level. So we know that the issue of child sex abuse material is really of critical concern for children and young people, not only in Ireland but worldwide. And I mentioned that in some of the statistics. One of the studies we looked at found in Western Europe, 1 in 5 children reported experiencing unwanted or pressured sexual interactions online before the age of 18. That is really serious. In the last week, since we finalised the content, we've seen this shift in policy with significant consequences for children and young people, with a further dilution of an existing weak commitment whereby there is a voluntary arrangement at EU level whereby platforms will undertake limited monitoring for child sex abuse material. However, due to an argument between 2 EU institutions, this may cease on the 3rd of April. So that's really, really of concern from us. Already the policy that was underway was extremely weak, but to see that cease as well is very, very concerning for us. So what we would like to see is that we need to see really maintain pressures on our MEPs to support the continuation of this existing work. But really, we have an opportunity in Ireland with the forthcoming EU presidency in the latter half of this year to strengthen and promote the protection of children's rights in this area in EU legislation. So we would really like to see the Irish government prioritise the completion of the recast directive on child sex abuse material, and an effective regulation and a reclassification of AI chatbots, notification apps, and deepfakes as identified them really as manipulative and needing to be prohibited or be under strict control. So it's really, really critical that the government leverages this opportunity as it takes on the presidency of the EU Council to strengthen the legislation in this area. As the individual putting in the question has said, like, this is a really very serious area. It's something we published a press release on last week, and we are continuing to exert pressure on MEPs who can be influential in making decisions in this area. I don't know if this is something that Angelica and Jack want to provide their own input on, because I know it's of really critical concern for young people.
I definitely think it is something that needs to be more regulated, especially with under 18s. I think like AI or like social media in general, and that was kind of in my childhood from kind of what I can remember. Like, I'm 20 years old, but I was on social media from probably the age of like 11. And I think there's there was no regulations, and I still don't think there's enough regulations that children can have access to anything. I think with the issues on X, with the AI bot there, I think it's so dangerous. You really don't know. I don't think any of us know the extent of how dangerous it can be, and I think it moves so fast as well, which is the scarier thing, because once you think you're caught up on it, then there's a new advancement. And I think yeah, I definitely think with Ireland being in the EU presidency, I think we have the ability to have that push from July, and I think we have to speak out, because we don't know what issues are going to arise from this, but surely there's going to be quite bad issues that will arise. So I think we have to stay on top of it and continue to put the pressure, because it's just going to be an ongoing thing in our lives from now on, and that's kind of the reality of it, I think.
I do think as well, it's the onus is on the government to really take leadership here. I think Ireland is in a very unique role in terms of the location of certain headquarters of platforms within Ireland. And we would really encourage the government to take a leadership role and leverage that opportunity with the EU presidency to do that. We have seen and we've noted in report card that they are continuing to invest in Coimisiún na Man, but as I was saying earlier, we've seen provision for the establishment of an independent complaints mechanism, but we really need to see the rollout of that, as well as support for the I think it's the verified flaggers that is part of that legislation as well. As Jack was saying, it is very fast moving. I mean, I couldn't believe it when Nolene and Alex were telling me, "Oh, this is already out of date." There are things happening all the time in this area, and it's really critical that the government stands up to big tech, but also takes a children's rights perspective and listens to people like Jack and Angelica. I mean, I've just been blown away this morning. I've just delivered such impressive analysis of the content of report card. It's really beholden on the government to ensure that all children's rights are upheld.
Okay.
Can I just
course, yeah.
jump in? This sometimes what we do, and I obviously agree with everything that's been said. But sometimes what we do is we separate the young people's online life within the real world. This is young people's lives now. They live seamlessly between the two, and that's and when we compartmentalize young people's lives, and Jack and Angelica can keep me right because I'm clearly not a young person. Then what we do is we don't see the whole impact on them, and we need, particularly here in Northern Ireland, as two women in the last 10 days or so have been murdered. We need to recognise that all these are connected. So that we absolutely need to keep our children safe, but we can't forget that not keeping them safe online spills into the physical space as well, particularly when it comes to violence against, or including, not particularly, but including when it comes to violence against women and girls. So we need to see this in the whole, as Naomi says. This is a children's rights issue. This is a whole child and a whole life issue, and to compartment online and real world life doesn't see the realities of the way people lead their lives. So I just wanted to add that on top of what the others have said.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks for that. Sorry, Angelica. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
If I may, this is a really, really important issue, and so often the problem here is that, as I think Naomi kind of alluded to, when we have legislation, by the time the legislation is in place, there's new developments. You mentioned earlier, which is rather innocuous, 6, 7. I'm going to be very, very honest that I worked part-time in a school. That was something that I had about, 7 months ago. And it just goes to show how, we can't be playing catch up with legislation that is so crucial for children's lives. We need to have legislation that's flexible and that's fast acting, and having those mechanisms is so important, because when it comes to online safety, taking a child's rights-based approach is so important, because it's not just a case of, taking things away from children and young people, because for some children, that's kind of how they see it because they had grown up with social media, but it's about educating them as well on the dangers, because so many young people aren't aware of this. Like, if you're growing up, you don't understand, why is this being taken away from me? Why can't I have this? But it is so dangerous. And as you've just said, Kula, it does carry on. And it's also about educating the school community too, because teachers and principals, when cyberbullying incidents happen, that translates into the schoolyard, and that's something that they have to struggle to, and they don't have the resources necessarily to deal with as well. So it's really, really important that we take an approach that's not just online safety based, but also, comprises the environments that these young people are in, so that their parents are educated and their school environment is also able to deal with this as well.
That's an excellent point, Angelica, and really appreciate that. Thanks. We've I've been asked just to note there's an ask from ECLAG to email MEPs ahead of the vote. And so they're encouraging everyone on the call here to email all members of the European Parliament as soon as possible to urge them to support the extension of the legal basis that allows online service providers to detect sexual abuse content on their platforms. And they do have a template email and contact list translated in all EU languages. So, and they just thank us for support on that. That's from Cyber Safe Kids that ask has come through there. So maybe just go back to you, Naomi, in terms of the report card as well. And in relation to this programme for government, what are the 3 priority areas that could make the most impact, do you think, over the next 4 to 5 years to ensure that Ireland is one of the best places to grow up?
Apologies, just on mute there.
Okay.
So I think we've very specifically chosen these 5 areas because we think that systemic change is needed really in across those areas, and like coming back to Kula's point, they're not just standalone areas, but they are so much interlinked. And I think Jack and Angelica have really spoken to that today when we talk about the impact that housing has on mental health, on education. How on earth can you study for your Leaving Cert and take on that pressure when you are living in a hotel room with your family? That is really, really difficult. So I think for me, some of the things that I was thinking about, I do think that it is really critical that the government builds those 12,000 social homes each year. Because when we are tracking other government commitments on homelessness, of course they are important, but we could ensure that we are no longer needing to prevent homelessness if we have a functioning housing system, if we have actually 12,000 social homes built each year. Tanya Ward, our CEO, was on David McCullough this morning, and coincidentally, right before her interview, there was an interview with somebody who was going to build 100,000 houses in the Netherlands. And like, that is just striking. Imagine that is their goal, to build 100,000 houses, and we are far off that. So we really need to see stepped up action in that area. That would unlock so many other things. In the area of mental health, I think the second thing that we really need to do is we need to develop that new primary care psychology model. We need to ensure that children and young people are getting supports as early as they can. It's really just so important. In relation to online safety, I would also say we need to see the introduction of the independent complaints mechanism. We know at the minute all children and young people can do when they have a complaint about what is happening online is go to the provider themselves. That's simply not adequate. We have provisions in legislation to introduce that mechanism, and we need to see it come in. When we look at the data, we know that 93%, I think it is, of children under the age of 12, I think it's 8 to 12-year-olds, have access to a device. And we know that increases as we go throughout adolescence. So this is an integral part of children's lives. And I suppose the reason I'm emphasizing that now is that we've never seen that the proliferation of this amongst children and young people in generations past. It's something new, and it's something that the government has yet to get to grips on, and to really call big tech companies to account in this area. One of the things that we do talk about is I think before banks weren't regulated, but we were able to bring that in, and we were able to regulate banks and regulate financial institutions, and we need to be doing the same in terms of ensuring children and young people's safety online.
Right. Thanks, Naomi. There's a question that come in there from Erin, and it's a question for Angelica and Jack and the full panel. There was mention of the EU presidency. Is there anything Ireland can learn from other EU countries when it comes to ensuring children live happy childhoods and young people are supported to reach their full potential, and that might inspire action in some of the areas tracked in the report card?
I think not necessarily in the EU, but I think kind of following from Australia and the social media ban, I definitely think it could be something. I know the government are looking into it, and there's other EU countries who are on the same track, and I think it is something that could be really beneficial. I mean, I think it has to, they have to, I think, consult with young people, but I think not necessarily a ban, but I think more of a regulation and more discussion about social media and kind of, I think, again, as I said with the complaints board, I think if you could have a place that you could raise issues for young people on social media, I think it would be really beneficial. I think kind of similar in the UK, again, not in the EU, but I think the ban on vapes as well. I think that's a huge thing for young people. I mean, the disposable vapes are banned there, and in Australia, the same vaping is banned. And I think stuff like that does affect mental health. Finances, obviously, physical health. I think it would help young people. If there's more regulations on advertising, because there's recently an initiative with the HSE and influencers to get young people to kind of stop vaping and targeted at secondary schools. But a lot of the young people were saying they feel it is targeted at them, and that's been said for a while, whether it's the colors, the flavors, and when you go into a shop it's in your face. So I think they're definitely things that could be looked at, that Ireland could kind of put a push on. And again, I think again, UK not in the EU, but I think but I think the ban on pornography for under 18s, because I think it's so accessible to young people across the EU, and I think that contributes to young people seeing violence against women, and I think it's a cycle. But I think the way that the UK have banned it, and you need to verify for certain sites and stuff, I think is such a good implementation that could be brought across the board, and it would prevent young people seeing sexually explicit content online. I think it could be a really positive approach to take, and it would prevent that kind of viewing from young people. At least there'd be a barrier in the way, as at the moment there's no such barrier.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jack. That's super.
Yeah, if I may, in regard to this question, I'm taking it to be more broader, as opposed to the EU presidency as a whole. But if we're looking, I have the map of the EU on my wall. I'm looking at it here, and obviously, when we're talking about quality of life for children and young people, it comes down to so many different things. But I'm going to focus here on just the education systems. If we're looking across Europe, we have these terminal sets of exams, which is completely different to what's in place. The German education system, I think, is one that's brilliant. They actually have no fees for higher level education. And when they say free fees, unlike Ireland, they actually do mean it. So that's one way, but also just the way they have their education system. It's not just, everyone is in the same school. There's different types of schools. There's schools that are more focused on technical areas, and then others that have a combination. And there's the gymnasium as well, which is the more kind of streamlined towards academic. I know that has its pros and its cons, but when we're looking at reform, there's so many countries in the EU that we can look from and we can learn from. And looking outside of the EU, there's the UK. The UK have a huge focus on contextual performance, which is taking into account how the backgrounds of the young people, where they've grown up, where they went to school, which I think, while we do that to a degree here, with programs like the Trinity Access Program and similar programs in UCD, I think it would be great that we could incorporate that into our admissions as a whole, as opposed to just for small amounts in individual universities.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. That's super. Okay. Maybe Neil, we just back to you. In terms of what do you think are the most serious breaches of children and young people's rights in the thematic areas that are covered in this year's report card?
Yeah, so I think I suppose the three areas that I would really pull out is firstly in the area of international protection. We've heard from Doris in the last week or two about the really serious breach of standards and breach of children's rights who are living in international protection. We are being strongly, I suppose, policies being strongly driven by outside political discourse on this area. And I think that that is really worrying. Oftentimes we forget that there are families here, children, mothers, parents, children, young people, who need our protection, and we are legally obligated to do that. And we need to ensure that we are living up to those legal obligations, and we are not seeing that in the current standards of accommodation that are being provided for many of these children and young people. The second area would be familiar to many people on the call listening is in the area of CAMS. We heard recently about the serious issues that occurred in Kerry for young people accessing those services. We really need to see the government step up and expedite action in this area to ensure that there are regulations that all CAM services are living up to, and that they're really being enforced and inspected on that. I do think one of the things that children and young people speak about an awful lot, and we have heard it here today, is the education system. And we see this right across the education system, where children are not being supported to realise their full potential. We see this in the emphasis on things like the Leaving Cert exam, the CAO point system. That is impacting on children and young people's mental health. We know that from talking to young people. I know that Angelica and Jack have spoken about this today. That is of real critical importance that we ensure that reform in this area is supporting children and young people to reach their full potential. More inclusive practices in schools, thinking about inclusive schools, thinking about how we can enable children to really perform to their best ability. Whereas at the minute, all we're doing is teaching children how to perform in an exam, or teaching young people how to perform an exam. That is not going to bear them well later in life. I do think that there's often a very adult-centered focus on education, in that we almost all wear the scars of the Leaving Cert and CAO system, and we all regale ourselves about, well, I got through it. That does not mean that we should still put that burden on young people. We should want more for young people and children today. And I think it's really critical across all of those areas that government ministers listen to children and young people, include them in the decision making and policy making, to ensure that we really have policy making that's fit for purpose. It's coming back to Kula's point about the child rights impact assessment, which all governments should be undertaking when they're initiating new policy developments, new pieces of legislation, and responding to emerging issues in Ireland today.
Right. And on that, Naomi, I mean, you're obviously very involved in putting the report card together and assessing, performance and everything else. And there are, areas where progress is being made. And, is there a magic formula in there, to for those areas where the progress is, being achieved and a real impact is being made?
There are a couple of things that are really critical. So, this edition of Report Card, it's the first year. We're not going to see the realisation of progress that can be made over a 5-year period. If we look back on the last Report Card series, where we can see where commitments got a really high grade, they took incremental investments each year. They built on the progress they made the year before. And at the end of the year, the government was achieving a high grade, a B or an A grade in that area. It's really, really important that we embed children's perspective, their participation in decision making. We see that in senior cycle reform. We know that in recent, before Christmas, we know that Corlin and Nogue presented to the senior cycle forum to talk about how they are impacted by stress due to Leaving Cert, etc. They are areas where the government is taking on board what young people are saying, and incorporating that into the development. It's really important they continue to do that. Making a strong foundation is really important. One of the really positive areas that we've seen is really strong foundation in the area of increasing the number of spaces for childcare for earlier services. Because the department are doing this in a very evidence way. They're building a model to forecast where will new childcare spaces be needed in the coming years. And so that's going to inform how they develop state-led childcare facilities. That is really important, that they take those important foundations, but we need to see action at the end of that. We need to see the addition of extra places through that evidence. So we know from the Department of Children that there could be up to an additional 800 spaces available through state-led childcare facilities this year. So we need to see that evidence, but real implementation. Finally, the other area that I think is really critical is legislating for change. So we know that there could be a real change in how CAM services are delivered if we regulate for standards if we legislate for regulations in that area. And if we look back in the last report card area, one of the commitments we chose at the start was specifically looking at a piece of legislation. And once that was realised, we stopped tracking it because the government had achieved it. Now there are questions: do we keep looking at it in terms of implementation? Of course, implementation is important, but we need to see the government put commitments into legislation. The area that got the highest grade is somewhere where they are going to legislate for the interagency work on child protection and welfare.
Right, thanks. And Naomi, there's a kind of follow-on question for you there as well, and from Louise from St. Pat's. She was wondering, re your point around CRIA and the new policies and legislation. Should that apply to government policies and legislation related to environmental issues, for example, that have climate or pollution impacts, given differential impacts on children and their mental and physical health, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So we should be seeing the CRIA process embedded right across government. And it's really welcome that the Department of Children has taken a leading role in this. This was on building on work that the Children's Rights Alliance did in collaboration with the department under our recently finished strategic plan. And what we actually wanted to look at was the emergence of the crisis of COVID. And that was the impetus for looking at this work, to see how are children and young people's rights taken into consideration when we were making these big decisions to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So what we saw was that the schools in Ireland were closed for the longest time. I think it was one of the longest time across Ireland, and wasn't really taken into consideration. How is that impacting on children and young people? We also had the nature of the closure of schools meant less children and young people were being seen by protective adults. And we've seen recently with the establishment of the Wellbeing Project the serious consequences that did come about because of that. So of course, we should be applying CRIAs to all policies in Ireland, including those responding to environmental climate crisis, so that we're taking into account what the impact is on children and young people. I've no doubt that Jack and Angelica have have a lot of thoughts about this area.
Thanks for that, Naomi. I'll just keep moving. Just a few more questions have come through there as well. So Margaret from the National Parents Council has asked: have the government been asked to coordinate or to consider early years education as a children's right, similar to primary and post-primary education? This would help with equal access for all children. Currently, lack of places and children with needs being refused in places in early years. I don't know if any of our panelists have a view on that. Is it something that has been asked of the government, or is it something that should be asked of the government?
So it is something that there's been work done at, I think it's at the UN level. I need to just double check what the body is, where they are looking at the right to education from children's very early years. Certainly for us, what we really welcome in this programme for government is the commitment to develop state-led facilities. But there's also another commitment that we are tracking. Now we are scoring them on two commitments together. And this is where they would initiate funding, capital funding to expand childcare places within the education campus. So that kind of combines that kind of combines primary school together alongside early years. There is also a commitment within First Five to really establish that as a right, and we think that that's really important. What we will see is that as we see a greater expansion of government investment in state-led facilities, that should be beginning to address where there is a dearth of places. But we would really like to see that all of this capital investment, issues on affordability, that they should be taken a children's rights perspective, which says, and there's a general comment from the UN Committee on the Rights of a Child, looks at how these services are of high quality. That is of critical importance. We need to stop thinking about childcare as a way to get more people out to work, but as a right in itself for young children, and how we ensure that there is high quality provision provided for them. And certainly the measures that have been introduced by the government in the last number of years help us to move towards that with further investment in quality provision. So ensuring that we have a graduate-led workforce, ensuring that we are improving year on year the pay of early years providers. And so we should be almost bringing them up to the same pay as primary school teachers.
Thanks, Amy. Cool. I don't know if you have any views on that. I mean, I saw you're nodding in agreement. Is there anything else you
just everything Naomi says, early education, early years support. I'm always loath to call it education, but supporting families and children in the early years is critical. It's absolutely critical, and it's 100% a right. And Programme for Government and Young Ireland are full of a number of initiatives. Naomi talks about First Five. There's Equal Start. There's a lot going on, and I know there's conversations about do we need an early years body to make sure that's bedded in. So 100%, because we know if we can support parents and families in the earliest of years, then we are setting the right trajectory. Just very quickly, Colin, you talked about what we can learn from EU countries, and thanks guys for reminding me that the UK is not in the EU anymore. It makes me weep every day. That most European countries, children go nowhere near a classroom until they're 6 years old. And I know in my home country of Cyprus, my children were starting school at 4 and their cousins were going at 6. And I don't see any difference in them now that they're into young adulthood. So I think, and if that's the case, then we're looking at really providing stronger early years support. But I think that sometimes there is a lot to learn in school age from Europe. There's a number of other things, but I'm mindful of the time. But that one that springs to mind.
Thanks, Colin. I suppose we're just coming near the end here. I think there's a nice question here that'll kind of wrap things up nicely for us. And first of all, there's a comment in from Kira, which everyone on the call will agree that we our participants today are amazing advocates. So well done, and thank you all. So thank you so much for your participation on that. But the last question from Teresa there is for Jack and Angelica. It's great to hear your views and your ideas about the issues covered in the report card. Of all the commitments being tracked and the issues they cover, do you have one key priority for the government to improve on for next year's report card? And maybe we'll start with Jack.
I think it's a great question. I think probably housing, just because it affects every other aspect of a young person's life. So I think to focus on housing specifically for young people and more supports. Because as highlighted kind of by everyone, it affects young people's mental health, their education, their relationships, and their overall well-being. So I think if the government could focus on kind of housing supports for young people and families, I think we'd be in a different situation this time next year, and I think it would positively affect every other aspect.
Right. Thanks, Jack. Angelica?
Yeah, I fully agree with Jack. I think we need to do a lot better on housing and homelessness. I think as we've heard, that is really the bedrock. It's the foundation that allows a young person, a child to thrive. And without a home, you cannot be expected to go to education, to have good mental health, and to have a good future. I think that's something that we need to do a lot better on, and we can look to Europe for that. We have an EU presidency, so let's hopefully learn some lessons from what everyone else is doing a lot better than us.
Brilliant. Thanks, man. So I just want to thank everyone for your participation today and for all our attendees. The Children's Rights Alliance, we wish to thank all those who've contributed to researching and compiling this report, especially all of our members, stakeholders, and the government departments who fed into the report. In particular, the Children's Rights Alliance would like to thank our partners in helping to produce Report Card 2026, including PUBL, the Department of Rural and Community Development, the Community Foundation Ireland, the Shield Foundation, Rethink Ireland, and the Catherine Howard Foundation. A huge thank you, as I said, to our speakers today, to Princess, Harrison, Louisa, Angelica, and Jack, and Kula. And thank you so much for everything you've brought to today's discussions. Thanks also, huge thanks to Naomi and all in the Children's Rights Alliance team for their Trojan work in compiling the report and in coordinating today's launch. The event today will be available to watch on the Children's Alliance Facebook page and I think on YouTube as well. And I would encourage you all to continue engaging with this year's report using the hashtag ReportCards 2026. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up. Again, thank you all for your participation. Hopefully you've enjoyed the event, and that we continue to the report card continues to fulfill the really important function that it does in terms of keeping governments to account for promises they make, and ensuring that children's rights and children and young people's voices are heard. So thank you all very much.